Good morning. Great to join us today to talk about product liability in life sciences. I'd imagine you probably had quite a few presentations, so you've done a lot of research into the positive side of the regulatory legal framework, but the liability side, when things might go wrong, when individuals could possibly be injured, and people might bring litigation against your companies alleging a defect, is something you do need to consider and be aware of. So that's what we're talking about today. As we go through, by way of a bit of guidance, I've flagged a few moments where I'm suggesting some action points to take away with you as you develop your companies and products. I'm also inviting you at a few moments as we go through the main part of the presentation to drop some thoughts into the chat box for us to consider as we look at all these issues. So, product liability in life sciences. What are we talking about? When we talk about product liability, and this is the language of lawyers, insurers, regulators, potentially investors as well, what we're talking about is the risk that your company could be sued because of an allegation that your product has caused a user, could be a consumer, could be a patient, injury or death. And experience tells us that it's the innovative products that have a particularly increased exposure to product liability risk. That's because if you take a pretty standard medical device or pharmaceutical product that's been on the market for a long time, it's understood, everybody knows the side effects, the clinicians are very well used to using it, there are no particular surprises, and it's been in the field for long enough to kind of iron out all those bumps. Whereas innovative products, they're new, until they've been out in the market for a while, you might not fully understand them. And also on top of that, regulators are constantly playing catch up. So you might not have the full protection from the regulatory system that your more standard products would normally come with. So my aim is to try and give you a bit of an understanding about what to guard against, identify some key issues which you might need to take away to talk to investors or insurers, but perhaps more importantly, try and foresee the problems that might arise and what you can do to mitigate those potential problems. And why is it important now? Well, it's quite an exciting time in the world of liability law. New legislation is coming in. The EU has got a new directive which has to be implemented by member states by the end of 2026. And as of a couple of months ago, the UK government and regulators and law commission have made it clear that there's new law coming into the UK as well. So it's a pretty pivotal moment. It's also all coming at a time of increased consumer patient demands. So you're probably finding in a positive way that the market wants more, expects more, but every time patients, doctors, consumers have higher expectations, the flip side of that is there could be disappointment and there could be litigation off the back of it as well. Coupled with lots of excitement, increasingly AI is seen by governments and regulators as the future, freeing up doctors, improving healthcare, reducing waiting lists and so on. So the spotlight is coming to these products, and the legislation is beginning to catch up with it as well. And as we go through this, I'm going to talk about products generally. I'm going to talk about medical devices generally, because that's the framework. It's useful to know about it, but where I can, I'm going to highlight particular issues that relate to software and artificial intelligence as well. And most of what I say is in common to whether you're looking at the UK market or the EU market, because they share a common history. So all these general principles will apply to whichever of the two jurisdictions you're putting your products onto the market in. So let's get going with a first question of you to drop into the chat. When you think about liability risks in your companies, your products, how you feeling at the moment? What's your sense? Do you feel, for example, on top of it? Is this something which is just not on your radar? Something you're parking for the future, keeping you up at night, or feeling you're on top of it with all your advisors? So a few thoughts in the chat to get us going would be great.
Don't see anyone typing. Just double checking the chat is working for everyone who's here. You can see it. It's letting you type.
I can see someone type. Yeah. I can see Aroka typing.
But a few essays being written by the looks of it.
Maybe there's complicated feelings about this.
Maybe they are, yeah. 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 That point there about balancing innovation with regulation is quite a key theme that runs through guidance from regulators and governments. They have a tightrope to walk. They need to promote innovation, help get things to the market, but also the primary role of regulations and regulators is to keep the public safe. So keeping something across the market, and it's something you have to balance as well as a manufacturer. So see if any other comments come in before we move on.
There's a couple of likes on that comment, so I think there's people in agreement rather than
I
anything.
think that's a good way of looking at it. And as you develop your products and your offerings, your perception of risk and actually the way you've got to grapple with it will change over time, and the exposures you come up against. Possibly at the moment, if your products are still in development, will be a bit uncertain, but there's lots you can do now to get ready for it. Yeah. So moving on to the law, this is really the outline of what you need to know about. So as a manufacturer, you could be sued, or producer, distributor, you could be sued in one of three different ways. In principle, you could be sued under contract. This is much more likely where you've got a product which is maybe more consumer facing, so members of the public can buy it. And if you put a product on the market and it causes an injury or death to somebody, you could be sued under the contract on the basis that your product hasn't delivered the safety standard that is set out in the contract or an implied term. The second way you could be sued is not contractual. That's a sort of default position in law that where there's no contract, no other way of suing you, just by putting a product onto the market, making it available for people, allow them to use it, creates what lawyers call a duty of care to the public. So you have to act as a reasonable manufacturer in what you do. So when you put a product on the market, it's reasonably safe. And now, if you put a product out there and you haven't carried out proper testing, you've maybe turned a blind eye to adverse events you're picking up from experience, or maybe you've made some poor choices about how you design the product, then you're exposed there to an allegation that you haven't met the standard, you've not been reasonable, and you can be sued in negligence for that. And although you might be compliant with regulations, obligations go beyond that, and this won't give you an automatic defense. Now, the third area is the one we're going to focus on. This is the strict liability regime. And the reason we're focusing on it is this is the mechanism that usually claimants will use. Claimant law firms are very familiar with it, and the whole system has been designed to make it easier for consumers to sue manufacturers. And we use consumer in a very loose sense. We're talking about anybody who has any sort of interaction with the product. Could be a patient, could be a hospital setting, could be out there in the public. And critically, the person who sues you does not have to have a contractual relationship. They don't have to prove negligence. They've just got to follow the pathway under this act to be able to claim against you. And we'll look into how that works now. So pausing for a moment, here's some action points. When it comes to your contracts, just bear in mind, there's a potential to be sued under a contract you might have with somebody over a product. So be very careful about your standard terms. What are you offering to people? Have you had them looked at? Can you protect yourself? Your contract may say one thing, but if you've got marketing materials promising more or describing the product in a different way, that will be taken into account by the court, and you may find claimants arguing that because you're basically offering a product in keeping with your marketing materials. That's the standard you'll be kept to. And if you've got any kind of contracts where you're providing a product in a supply chain, then look at your liability caps as well. But that's contractual, that's negligence. You need to really be focusing on this issue of strict liability. So I've set out here the test. This is under the Consumer Protection Act, but what the court will be looking at is, can a claimant prove a product is defective? How do they do it? They have to show to the court that the safety of the product is not generally as people are entitled to expect. And what the court has to do is it has to look at various areas to work out, what should the product have done and did it do it? The court will look at your marketing, how you presented the product. They will work out whether the product has been used reasonably. And if it's not been used reasonably, if it's been misused, could you as a manufacturer have foreseen that? And they will judge your product by the standards of when it was put on the market, not by the standards of now. So, if scientific understanding has moved on, if there are better products on the market, you can argue that doesn't matter. Really, to be held to account, you need to be held to account by what was known at the time you put your products on the market and it came into supply. Roughly speaking, there are three types of defect. There could be a manufacturing defect. So you may have a perfect design, very safe, but actually when it came to the manufacturing, construction of the product, maybe the programming, updating of software, in that case, maybe the product deviated from the design and that could be a defect. Or potentially the defect could be in the design itself. So this is the worst case scenario, the entire product line is flawed. And if that is the case, then you are potentially facing a big exposure, because in principle, if every single product is defective because of the design, then you're possibly waiting to see how many claimants might bring very similar claims against you. And the third way a product can be defective is to do with the warning. So legally speaking, if a product has the risk of side effects, it's got the risk of perhaps not performing to the high level that everybody expects at all times, if your warnings are adequate, if your instructions for use, if your guidance is up to date, if your disclaimers are very clear, then legally speaking, you can cure a defect by showing the information that came out with it, properly warn users about the limitations of the product. So you shouldn't be liable. And then when it comes to software and AI, obviously there are quite a few issues to do with these particular products that don't come across in other products, like your hip implants, for example, your pharmaceutical products. So, you may be dealing with bugs and coding errors. You may have performance failures because of algorithm issues, maybe an issue with bias in the algorithm. It could be that in principle, you've got a good product, but the training data is inadequate. It may be you get to court and actually the software is so complicated, there's so much of a black box problem, you can't really explain why it's not defective and why it fails, which will be difficult. And equally, with AI, you've got the unique risk of cybersecurity problems. And if you've put a product in the market and it could be hacked, it could be influenced by other people, then you put a product in the market that's not safe, and the court will look at that as well. And then another unusual feature of software is, unlike a physical product, once you've put either a product that uses software or some software on the market, every time you update it, legally speaking, you're creating a new product. So every time you create a new product, you could potentially be creating new liability risks that you need to guard against. So those are the issues the court will look at. Those are the areas where you could be found to have a defective product. And those are some of the issues that I think for software and AI, you need to be particularly aware of. But even if a claimant can get through all that, and they can prove a product is defective as a matter of law, the claimant must still prove that your product caused the injury on the balance of probability. So a more than 50% chance it was your product, not something else. And this gives the parties to litigation a challenge when it comes to medical devices. Often, inevitably, in a hospital setting where a medical device is being used, the patient has underlying existing health conditions. They may have, multiple comorbidities. There could be clinicians making critical decisions. There's a possibility of clinical negligence. And there could be a bit of a time lag between when the product was used and the injury that was the outcome. So lots of the court to unpack there. And when it comes to AI and software, there could be a debate over, did an algorithm cause harm, and how can you exclude user error? Trying to show using records that a product was used incorrectly and the underlying product was safe can be much more complicated than, say, an orthopedic product, where it may be a bit more obvious based on expert evidence whether a clinician used that product properly or not. And the evidence the parties will need to get to grips with can be extensive. So the claimant will have to disclose their medical clinical records, and the experts will look at that to try and determine, what was the cause of the injury. If there's other data out there where similar products may have failed or caused injury, and you're trying to prove how a product should perform and whether it was good enough, you may find that you have to get stuck into scientific studies, particularly where data is being collected, if there are statistics, registry data. For both sides, the claimant may say, look, we can look at registry data, we've got the stats, we can see that a product like this is supposed to perform at a particular level, but actually your product has not met that standard. Or you could, as a defendant, say, actually, if you look at how these products perform on the market, it's early days, you can't fully rely upon it. There are known side effects, there are known potential flaws in the system, but our product met the standard. So when it comes to software and AI, you should be thinking about, if you've got decision logs, can you prove how this product was put together? Have you got access to your training data to show to the court that with expert evidence, you can look at the data and show this product was properly programmed, properly put together? Can you maybe give access to the source code to demonstrate how the product was created? If all that happens and the claimant can still get through all that, and they've proved defect and they've proved that your product caused the loss, then the court will find in favour of the claimant, but will have to then assess damages. So this will vary according to the individual. It can be very wide-ranging. Assessing how much an injury is worth is relatively straightforward, because there are guidelines to do with previous cases where courts have looked at this. So you can work out, you're facing a £20,000 claim, £50,000, £100,000, possibly more than that. But you have to add to that any specific circumstances to do with that individual. So if that individual, for example, because of the defective device, couldn't go back to work and they had a well-paid job, then you could be on for a loss of earnings claim. If the individual perhaps was left permanently injured and they had to make changes to their house, they had to get further support in, that can also be claimed for as well, so that can be expensive. And if there are, family involved, dependents, then you could be on the hook for that as well. So every individual claimant will present themselves in different ways when it comes to the potential damages that you might have to pay for if the claimants are successful. And getting an early view on damages is a key part of working out your litigation strategy, because it can be, if the claim is small, there's not a lot of damages involved, you're comparing the amount you might pay out versus the amount it will cost to defend the claim, then you might be looking at taking a very commercial decision and saying, well, should we settle this claim to avoid the cost and potential bad PR of litigation? So a few things to think about there. Given that see now something of what the claimants need to demonstrate when it comes to showing the product's defective, whether it caused the loss, you can understand that as a manufacturer, it's really important that you maintain your technical documentation. So in the event of litigation or pre-action correspondence where claimant law firms write to you saying they're thinking of bringing a claim, you've got access to the information to show how your product was designed, the care you took when it came to, for example, programming, stress testing it against cyber attacks and so on, to show that actually you took care to put a decent product on the market. So it's important to keep this evidence in case you need to use it. And then get used to as well being prepared to carry out some root cause analysis. So if you are finding that your product is to complaints and injuries and maybe negative feedback from hospitals, have you got a decent system in place so you can analyse why this is happening? Not just so that you can argue your case in the event of litigation, but also your regulatory obligations over vigilance to show that you're assessing why things are happening, and if necessary, you're taking steps, which could involve either corrective actions, maybe redesigning the product, or it could be issuing new guidance to hospitals, or it could be, worst case scenario, it could be recalling the product and working out exactly what has gone wrong so that when you relaunch, you've corrected those problems. So that's really the legal framework of what you need to be aware of. As I said at the beginning, it is a time of new law coming in, and I think it's probably best if we start with the EU, because that's where the key developments have been taking place. So what have we got here? It's up till now, and including now until next year, the strict liability law in both the UK and the EU is woefully out of date. So the law goes back to 1985 when the Product Liability Directive came in. It's a piece of 1980s legislation, and in some ways it has worked. It was the first iteration of the strict liability regime. It took the burden off claimants to demonstrate negligence or a contractual connection. And it's not a very long piece of law either. The problem really has been that, although it sounds quite simple, the courts have in effect been grappling with this law for the last 40 years or so. It also, because it's 1985, it just predates the modern era. So this is a law that came in during the analog era, a couple of decades before the smartphone. Internet hadn't properly been invented. AI wasn't known about outside of science fiction. So it's no surprise really that lawmakers decided that this area needs to be massively reformed. So the directive, which until now and including now still forms the basis of UK law, has been completely revised. What we've got is a new directive. The text was finalised during 2024, and it must become national law in member states by the end of 2026. And the reasons we've been given by the EU for this is that they say that the new law needs to be brought in now because there's just too much legal uncertainty because of issues with the law not keeping up to date with new tech. The EU has cited specifically AI, new circular economy business models, global supply chains, and so on. And on top of that, there's been a general, I suppose, from a public policy point of view, disappointment that actually this law has not been as easy to use by claimants to seek compensation, and it's been too complicated and too expensive. So the idea is that you make it a better system for claimants, and you can resolve all these issues in one go. And here's a slide setting out what's going on. The key thing really, I suppose, is that the range of products which are caught by the directive is now expanded. There had been a debate, or there still is a debate, under the old law about whether software is actually a product, which means that you can be sued under the strict liability regime, or whether software is actually a service, which means you couldn't be, and you have to be sued another way. So the EU is taking the opportunity to make it clear that software is now actually a product. So that means there's no debate. This would be the law that claimants could use to bring a claim. And that means that effectively we're talking about operating systems, firmware, computer programs, apps, AI systems. It doesn't matter if the software is on a physical product or whether it's accessed via a network or the cloud. Software will now count as a product. So any manufacturer, producer of software can be sued if it's connected to alleged failure and injury. So that means that your products will now be firmly within the scope of the directive. And the implications of this are that you need to look at who's potentially going to be sued. They've taken the opportunity to expand the idea for a manufacturer is. It's now expressly a software developer. And when it comes to supply chains, more players in the supply chain can be sued more easily. What the law is trying to do is to make sure that there's somebody within the EU who can be sued in the event of allegedly defective software. So that could be distributor, supplier, or the manufacturer, depending on who is available as a target for litigation. You should assume, though, the manufacturer will be the primary target because the court will probably see that manufacturer of the software or the product as the individual company that had the most control over the product, could decide how it's going to be placed in the market, could decide what guidance went with it, what disclaimers, what warnings, and so on. And then we're looking at a new area here of the burden of proof. So in theory at least, it's still the claimant who has to prove a product's defective. So we talk about the burden of proof. You're alleging the product's defective. You, the claimant, have got to show the court why that is. However, because of the experience of the last 40 years, what this directive does is introduce this new sort of concept of a complex product. So if a product is deemed by the court to be complex, then the court is now going to take the view that a claimant, an individual with their law firm, are not best equipped to demonstrate a product was unsafe because the product is too complicated. A normal claimant with their law firm may not have the expertise without spending a lot of money on experts to prove how a product is defective. So if your product is deemed to be complex, then the burden of proof will flip. It's now down to the manufacturer defendant to demonstrate why their product is safe. And I think what we can expect to see here is when it comes to software and AI, the court is going to usually assume these products are complex, and therefore the burden of proof of proving how the product works and how it actually wasn't unsafe and met the safety standards and so on is now going to fall to you as a defendant manufacturer. So that is a pretty big change, and it means you'll have to do more work to defend your product. And crucially, you'll need to have your paperwork in order to prove how your product works safely, so that if you are facing litigation, you can demonstrate why your product is safe. And the final point to flag is to do with psychological harm. Until now, in principle, psychological harm and injury, as long as it's medically recognized, counts as an injury. However, it wasn't expressly put that way in black letter law. The EU has now included that expressly as a matter of legal certainty. So whilst it's not a change in principle, I think this will probably have an effect, because for the first time, you'll find that claimants can refer to a piece of law in the legislation that says injury will include psychological damage. So I think we can see a pushing of the boundaries here. It's almost like the law is now inviting claimants to bring these claims because it's now expressly recognized in law. So I think you'll see more claims for psychological damage. You'll probably see claimant lawyers trying to make those arguments more and judges being more receptive to it. And it could be that we'll see individuals, claimants, trying to make more of a link between AI and software and psychological harm and injury because of the nature of the products, either in a clinical setting or possibly more broadly, generally. I wouldn't be too surprised if we saw a few test cases, for example, over software that's maybe more consumer facing with the social media element. If people have allegedly been harmed psychologically by these products, then that could inspire some litigation. And when that happens, you may see more of a pathway opening up for people to bring these sorts of claims, which for any manufacturer of software, I think it increases your risk. So that's the EU's new shiny law. Lots to be aware of there, lots to get ready for if you're a manufacturer, but that is just the EU. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to have a quick chat about issues to do with Brexit. So generally, when it comes to the divergence between the UK and the EU, we generally tend to find that manufacturers will say, well, if we're going to update our laws, it probably makes sense to follow the EU model because our life sciences laws are based on the EU law anyway. If they need to be updated, we want to sell onto the EU market, so we should make our laws pretty much in keeping with the EU approach for certainty. But I'd be interested to know your views when it comes to liability. If we're going to update the UK law, would you be in favour of adopting the EU model, perhaps for certainty, or would you be rather in favour of the UK doing something different? So let's have your views.
Are we inviting discussion or just in the chat? Can people put their hands up?
Yeah, anything, any thoughts people have about, normally we talk about copying EU new law, but I'd be interested to know whether people would like that in this case. Yeah, we've got a hand up there from...
Yeah, it's Arokia here. I'm just wondering, if we don't involve customers from EU, should we still abide by EU regulations?
So if you're not placing a product on the EU market, then you wouldn't face any exposure under this particular new law. So this is all about jurisdiction. So EU court, France, Spain, Germany, if a claim is brought in those countries for a product placed in the market there. Having said that, if you're looking at other markets, if you're looking at the UK, you have the option, as you know, at the moment of still complying with the EU system CE marking. So you may, in any case, be using, for example, the medical device regulations 2017 as the basis for your products being placed in the market. And you might find by not preparing for putting products in the EU market, perhaps you're kind of creating problems in the future should you ever change your mind and decide to put products in the market there.
Thank you. And I was also wondering, sorry, an assessment tool. So we are, looking at, so we are developing an assessment tool.
Yeah.
So will that be considered a service or a product? And this is, say, a mental health assessment tool.
Yeah, it's likely to be considered a product. So there's these sorts of tools. It's an example of where new products are coming to the market, which and the regulations are quite old. I mean, arguably even the 2017 regulations are quite old, but you'll find regulator guidance will be issued from time to time that tries to kind of meet that gap. So if you take the UK as an example, you've had quite recent advice about mental health apps and so on, and you can follow a sort of framework to work out whether your product would be regulated as a medical device piece of software. And if it qualifies as a medical device, then it brings it within the liability framework for products. So by virtue of the fact it's being used as a product in the market, and if it's implicated in injury or death or some sort of adverse outcome, then I would expect to see claimants, if they're bringing a claim, to use this law for that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Canwell. Hi there. Yeah, thank you for the presentation so far. I don't feel particularly qualified to answer this, but just from purely a developer point of view, it's very difficult to have lots of different regulations that you have to satisfy. So a different one for the EU, a different one for the UK, a different one for the US. from the other side, I like the flexibility of being able to set your own rules, but from producing the software, from that side, it's very hard when regulations change from place to place.
Yeah, that's right. I think even a bit more added red tape, if you can find a way through it to increase your certainty and not have multiple systems and processes and protocols and so on, that in itself can be an advantage. Almost being compliant with the most onerous regime makes it simpler. There's also another point to make, I think, which is that if you are compliant with the most onerous regime, then actually, if you can avoid litigation in that jurisdiction, then it makes your product safer, less prone to litigation in other systems as well. Okay, well, let's have a look at what's happening in the UK, which might answer the question a bit. There's been a bit of belated change in the UK. So whilst the EU was getting on with its new directive, the ink dried on that in 2024, and it's coming into effect next year. There's been some change finally in the UK. There are two key things to be aware of. One is that the UK's got some new law. It's this 2025 Act, the Product Regulation Metrology Act. Reading the Act won't really help very much at the moment. The reason being is it's a very thin piece of legislation. The main purpose of this legislation is to allow the UK government to very quickly update UK product law to be ready for the modern era, reading between the lines, i.e. keep up with the EU system, because our law is based on EU law when it comes to products, certainly based on EU law when it comes to life sciences, but it's out of date. So the quickest way to keep things up to date and harmonise trading between the UK and the EU is to bring our law into line with the EU. So this law allows the government to do that. And the way it works is this is primary legislation. In the event the government wanted to introduce, for example, new liability law, it could do so under secondary legislation under the power given to it by this Act. So a sort of a weird effect of Brexit and taking control is that actually the government now can move very quickly to change law in a way that some people might see as not particularly democratic. So this means that everybody should be aware that change could come pretty quickly. Now, the way the government would do it, it would be via publishing draft legislation. It would do so via a consultation process. There would be a sort of transition phase. So it wouldn't happen overnight, but the point is now this new law has been enacted. It is possible, and it could happen relatively quickly. The next point to be aware of is that the Law Commission, which for the UK is the body that decides, it gives guidance to the government on where law needs to be updated and changed for changing circumstances, has over a number of years identified product liability as an area that needs to be updated. They've done so again recently over the summer. They've gone back to this topic. What they've said about the problems with the 1987 law that we've got based on the old European directive is extremely similar to what the EU has said about their new directive and why they brought it in. So the Law Commission has said, look, the old law just has nothing on software defects. It can't cope with embedded AI decision making, has nothing in it about cybersecurity. You've got to accept now there are more complex supply chains. We need some clarity over who's got digital product liability. Consumers haven't really been able to use the old law as well as they perhaps should have done. So different words, same point. The Law Commission for the UK has said that our law needs to be updated. We don't yet have a huge amount of information about what it will look like, but given that in every area so far when it comes to updating product law, the UK has looked to the EU for inspiration, not just because it's sort of academically sensible. You've got evolution of law that's been properly tested, put together by the EU based on the law we know, but also because business tends to say, look, if you're going to bring in new law, just make it in keeping with the EU so that we don't have to deal with multiple systems at once. So everything we've been looking at this morning to do with the new product liability directive, where you are looking at your systems, your processes, talking to investors, talking to insurers, about liability risks, my advice would be, best thing you can do, I think, at the moment, until we get more detail for the UK market, is just assume that the direction of travel is going to be very similar to what we've seen for the EU. And that way you're planning with, I think, added certainty. So, a few points to take away on that. Don't wait for the new EU law to take effect. It's taking effect end of next year, but we know what the law is. You can start to adopt best practices now. We've been talking quite a lot about making sure that you're recording your information, you've got good documentation about how you designed your product, how you've put it on the market, so that if you do need to defend it, you've got the information there. The new directive is going to put more of an onus on you as a manufacturer to demonstrate why your product's safe. So just be prepared for that. And then for the UK market, keep an eye on what's going on, because change is coming, and we'll find out more, I think, in the months ahead. I think it's worth pausing just to think about some unique challenges you might face if you're producing AI or software. A lot of the case law you'll find if you're sued and instruct lawyers is all to do with tangible products. It's not really very much so far about AI and software. So if you are targeted, it's a bit of a voyage of discovery, and there could be some issues that crop up here that you wouldn't see in other products, which you need to be alive to. And I put a few of them on the screen here. So safety risk caused by glitches and bugs. You just got to be aware of monitoring how your product's performing. Algorithms might not be fully understood by later programmers, might not be understood by clinicians. If you don't meet people's expectations, that kind of gap in expectation could lead to disappointment and a liability claim. You could be targeted for example, bias in your data or inadequacy of your system, or just not keeping it updated. As a defense lawyer, when it comes to physical products, what's always been quite a useful defense is to say, look, fine, this is a complicated product, but it was put in the hands of a doctor in a hospital setting. The clinician is that intermediary who should be making decisions about whether to use a product or not. But when it comes to AI, clinicians are trained in medicine, they're not trained in computer programming. You may find that this sort of lack of transparency, lack of understanding means that you don't really have access to those defenses about clinical oversight if you're providing a product that doctors don't fully understand. You've got a cybersecurity risk as well, so you could be prone to perhaps malicious attack from outside, which is totally unique to software, nothing you would see in case law to date. And a strange feature, I think, illegally speaking, of software is that we're very used to defending a product. It's put on the market, say, in 2020, and you assess its safety and its performance and the law as of 2020. But with software, every time you produce an update, you're effectively creating a new product. So you put it on the market in 2020, but you update it in 2025. You have to look at how things are in 2025, not 2020. And if you look at some examples, I put one on the screen here. You could maybe start to sort of gamify how this might work. So imagine you had a piece of AI claiming when you put it on the market, it's 95% successful, but actually in practice, it's only 85% successful, meaning that in a given case, perhaps somebody's cancer was missed. Then as a claimant lawyer, you'd be saying, look, you said 95%, this is 85%. It's not meeting the standard you said it was going to meet. There's a performance defect. Clearly the design is inadequate, and you failed to warn us about limitations. Whereas if you'd actually properly warned about it and said, actually, it's 85% accurate, and this is the reason we come to it, and this is why we still think it's worth you using, but with more human oversight, for example, then if you'd done that at the beginning when you put it on the market, it's the same product, same outcome, but actually you could have prevented that litigation by being more explicit in the performance and the warnings that should go with it. So bear all those in mind. For software and AI, you've got some unique issues to grapple with. But I suspect as time goes on, we'll see a bit more guidance, either in case law or regulatory guidance as well. And you may have to do a lot of explaining, because courts will not be used to this. Claimants will probably point to the directive saying burden of proof is now on the defendant. So you will need to do more to demonstrate how your product worked, how it was designed, put together, and why it's safe as well. This is a highly regulated area. A couple of things to bear in mind here. It would be a mistake to think that just because you're meeting regulatory standards, you've perhaps been signed off by a notified body or an approved body, that you're safe. You should only treat compliance as a baseline. There is plenty of life sciences litigation over the years alleging that products are defective. All those products were placed on the market legally. They were all there, having been signed off by notified bodies. But as time went on, they began to fail, and then claimants brought claims. So don't assume because you've been assessed and certified that you're safe. Having said that, if you are compliant with a regime, it's a good defense argument. There's enough case law to say the whole point of regulations is to make a product safe. We've complied with the regulations, therefore we've met a safety standard. So be compliant, use it to your advantage, but don't fully rely upon it, and just always think, what can you do to go beyond compliance to demonstrate your product is properly safe? And when it comes to proving your product safe, you should have lots of information. You should have data from your clinical phase. You should have lots of good data on post-market surveillance, showing that you monitored how the product was performing, almost like a kind of stage 4 clinical trial, that once it's in the market, you kept tabs on it, you properly engaged with hospitals and clinicians to get that information, and that you've documented how every time you update software through the life cycle of it, you've gone through the same assessment to make sure that the product is performing properly and is safe. So again, just gather your evidence, make sure you're on top of it, and be prepared to show that you understand the risks and benefits. So in our 85-95% example, yeah, there's a risk, maybe there's a 15% gap at scale of how the product will not perform in every case, but still on a risk benefit analysis, the product performs a useful function, but you've warned about the risks associated with it. And when it comes to hospitals or consumers, if it's on the market for the public, just make sure that the information that goes out with the product explains about the extent of its performance, what it can do, what it cannot do, what it's not designed to do, where you still need to have that crucial element of human oversight and clinical judgment as well. Quick word on timeframes. As a defendant, this all could be very useful for you. It's slightly stacked against claimants. So this is one area of law where actually the law is designed to work in manufacturers' favour. So once a claimant or potential claimant knows they've been injured and they've got a potential claim, they just have 3 years before they can bring a claim against you. So once the 3 years are up, if you've been aware of issues in the market or potential litigation, if the claim hasn't been brought, then that'll bring the curtain down on that. On top of that, there's a very useful 10-year long stop. At least there is at the moment under UK law, and it may change in the future. But this means that if a product's put on the market, a claimant can't use strict liability to claim against you once 10 years have gone by. So if you think of a sort of hypothetical example, somebody puts a product on the, you might put a product on the market in 2025. It may be 2035 before it becomes apparent to a claimant that they could bring a claim. And even though they've only just become aware of it, in principle, they've got 3 years to bring a claim. Because 10 years have gone by since you've put a product on the market, this particular avenue is not open to the claimant. They'd have to either look at contractual negligence, which is much more difficult. So when faced with litigation, you can look at timeframes. When was a product put on the market? When are people alleging that there was an injury? How much time has gone by? Are these claims potentially out of time? We could do a separate session on this, but wanted to mention group litigation because for life sciences products, it's a particular risk. The reason being that if you put say a pharmaceutical product, a medical device on the market, it could potentially be used by hundreds or thousands of people, and it might not be apparent there's an issue with it until years later. And if there is an issue with it, then because it's been widely used, you have this situation where you could face claims from hundreds or potentially thousands of people. So very simple maths, if you've got litigation where one claimant, the cost of defending it and legal fees and compensation might be, say, 100,000. If you've just got 1,000 claimants, then your 100,000 claims are 100 million. So you've got to be very alive to this particular risk for life sciences products that you may face lots of claims if it's been widely used. Yeah, we've got a question there.
Thank you. It's Arokia again. This 10-year long stop from supply, if you take an AI software and then say, for example, it was introduced in 2025, and then we're moving to in 2032, say, for example, they renewed, they updated. So then the 10-year, does it count from when they renewed, or is it from when it was out there in the first place?
Yeah, this is the problem with software. So if it's updated in 2032, the clock will start again.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the easiest way to think about this is maybe this 10-year long stop was actually brought in because of lobbying pressure from industry, who said to government, look, fine, create a new strict liability regime, but we can't be on the hook forever. We've got to have some certainty. So when it came to products, the idea in the 80s was that within 10 years it should be pretty obvious if something's defective or not. And a traditional product, a physical product put on the market, nothing happens to it. Software though is different. So I think you're right. For software, it's a unique problem, and you may find that you wouldn't as easily have this defense as other products.
Right. Okay. Because even with the updates, it depends on whether it was just a minor update or, a big one, isn't it?
I wonder if you could try and argue that a minor update didn't create a new product, but I think if anything is material in that update about how the product was used, and presumably a lot of updates will be to improve performance, then those material updates, I just don't think you'd argue long stop. If it was an immaterial update, there's going to be new case law, but I wouldn't want to rely upon it.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll finish soon so we can have a bit of Q&A, but I wanted to give you some case studies. Have a think about this as I'm talking, and it'd be interesting to know whether you sort of spot anything that you might learn as lessons for the future. So these two here, pelvic mesh and metal hips, are kind of the headline medical device piece of litigation for the last decade or so. So take pelvic mesh. The problems there were that it was prescribed by clinicians. It served a clinical function, but for some patients it caused chronic pain and infection and proved very difficult to be removed. The allegations to do with this product are to do with the products were rushed to the market without being properly tested before they went onto the market. Manufacturers did not carry out adequate risk assessments. On top of that, once it was in the market, manufacturers should have done more about post-market surveillance, and they failed to do so. And that there was inadequate wardings that went with it when the product was on the market. Metal hips, this was all to do with a new generation of metal hips. So first generation of metal hip implants were really for pretty elderly people, and they were designed to help people basically get out of bed, get to the shop. But in the 90s, you got new products in the market that promised a lot to younger people, so that people could have a hip implant, carry on playing golf, carry on with their active lives, you go running, all those sorts of things. And in fact, this is the product that Andrew Murray had to carry on playing tennis. However, after being on the market for a while, this unfortunate term was dreamed up called pseudo-tumors by a scientific paper. It's not cancerous, but the public read pseudo-tumor and feared the worst. In some people who received this product, pain was caused, and there were lots of issues associated with chronic comorbidities resulting from it because of not being mobile. It caused other health problems. It was alleged that the manufacturers had failed to take on board how the product was performing. They'd done some testing, but it didn't really simulate real world performance. And again, marketing departments took over, and there was not enough emphasis on putting the product onto the market slowly and properly monitoring the performance and then recalling the products quickly. So those are a couple of case studies. And you can see that AI, might attract arguments over diagnoses and problems with cybersecurity and bias. But having heard a bit about the history, it'd be interesting if you've picked up anything that you think, although it applies to physical products, you could take on board as a warning for the future. So again, any ideas, put your hands up or in the chat, would be great.
Jay.
Hi, Peter. So I develop AI algorithms for diagnostic use cases. And this kind of area of like diagnostic misses and algorithmic bias, it's very unclear what the standard is. So some people talk about the standard of as being as good as a normal doctor, which is around 78%, but I think the expectation is a lot higher for AI. Algorithmic bias, obviously, it's always going to be biased on the training data it has. So there's always going to be new cases, right? So again, it's really unclear what the standard is and what reasonable levels of preparation you can do to mitigate those. So, for example, with algorithmic bias, I have access to the secure data environment in the NHS. So would the standard be I would have to do massively in-depth analysis to make sure that my algorithm is basically is representative of every single patient I can possibly find within NHS retrospective data, is one which could be the best approach, but again, it's not necessarily realistic. So
so the first point, which I think you'll probably find quite helpful, is that I've been involved in litigation where the court accepted what's called the Volvo argument. So if you have a car and it's safe, but that you could be safer, it could be as safe as a Volvo. Just because the Volvo exists does not mean that your product, which is less safe than a Volvo, is defective. So in your case, because you can always improve the quality of the data population, just because in principle you could always do more, doesn't mean that because you haven't done all those things, maybe using a wider population, it means your product's defective. So you've got that useful argument, which is from case law. And then you've got another point to make, which is the court has to assess products on a risk-benefit basis. So the court is fully aware, and it's on the record, that anything in the clinical setting creates risk, side effects, potential failure. But where a product is deemed to be needed, so the public needs a product, and AI in clinical settings obviously ticks that box, then the court will carry out a risk-benefit analysis. And so what's the alternative if the product's not there, if the AI is not possible? That's worse. So it's clearly there's a benefit to it, and there's a line to be drawn about where you accept a degree of risk. And when it comes to risk, it's important that you as a producer can demonstrate that you've carried out that analysis, but you've warned about the limits of your product. So, for example, a warning in the case of software to do with clinical validation or radiography, whatever it may be, will be that this product has been tested, it's not fully complete, perhaps it's another phase on the market, and it has to be subject to some human oversight, and studies to date have shown accuracy of X percentage. And then you've warned about the limitations of the product, so that if there is an allegation, you can say, look, it performed a clinical function. We warned about what it could and couldn't do, so it performed against that standard. And as time goes on, if industry does produce better standards, or even better, if the NHS produces more complete guidance, then you can probably refer to that as well as being part of the picture about what the court will deem the public should be able to expect.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anna, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Super helpful presentation. So I'm Chief Medical Officer at Heidi, which is an ambient tool. I guess I'm just thinking, because we support a large amount of consultations, and yeah, I'm just thinking more about the future and where these tools are going, and I wondered what your sort of sense is, given that, you know, we're likely to enter more of the direction that the EU is going in. What's your advice on the kind of wider way to think about, you know, post-market surveillance and kind of ensuring, I guess, like the education of clinicians as well? We know, you know, we've seen the kind of impact of these tools. I'm a clinician as well. We know that the impact on kind of frontline healthcare, but I'm thinking a lot about like how we support clinicians to understand the risks and challenges around these tools as well. I just wanted to get your sense and guidance on like thinking about all of.
Yeah, so when it comes to guidance for clinicians, you can do a lot by setting out what you as the manufacturer intend the product to be for. So there are plenty of examples where manufacturers have launched a product and they've stated it's for this purpose, but it's been used by users. It could be the public, it could be doctors in a clinical setting, for reasons that are outside of the scope of what you say it should be used for. So if you've done your testing and you've got a particular use for it, just make that very clear, because that would be a defense point that it was placed in the hands of an expert user, a reasonable user, the clinician, and if they used it in ways which are not in keeping with what you as the manufacturer said it was for, then that's your defense point, because it's being used unreasonably, which is really crucial. And then, sorry, the second part of your question I've just forgotten was
around the kind of post-market surveillance.
Oh yeah, the key point here is this is just, it should go hand in hand with your regulatory obligations. So MDR 2017, or the new regs which will come into the UK, we don't have them yet, but they're expected next year. Huge part of this is surveillance, and if you don't act on what you're seeing, then you'll be held to account for that, because you've been in breach of the regulations that are there for safety purposes. And you could also find this would add to a potential negligence claim that you weren't acting reasonably to do so. And I think it's probably fair to say a lot of the, I mean, if you look on the screen here, pelvic mesh, metal hips, really originated in an era before vigilance was taken as seriously as it is now. And I suspect these examples these days would actually be more about recall and corrective action, because companies are just better at vigilance and the data's better as well. Whereas because vigilance, those systems failed in these cases, they actually became liability cases. So I think that's probably what you'll see. More legal burden on ongoing compliance, hopefully less on liability risk.
Thank you.
I think Jay has got another question.
Yeah, sorry, it's a follow-up, Peter, about how courts assess the risk benefit analysis.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I have a tool which in a period of 12 months saved 100 people but injured one person, is it like that simple numerical? Is it like, how does that risk benefit analysis work in the kind of a medical setting?
Yeah, I suppose maybe the best way to look at it is to look at some of these examples from history. So Metal and Metal is actually a defense success story for the industry. And the view the court came to was that this generation of metal and metal hips provided a particular benefit that had not been there from the previous generation of metal and metal hips, or metal hips. So the view was that, yes, there are some particular risks to these products, Yes, there was probably a rate of injury that was higher for lots of actually explicable reasons compared to other products. But on a risk-benefit analysis, this was a product that there was a clinical need for it. It was improving the lives of the vast majority of patients who got it. Therefore, the risk outweighed the benefit. So the risk was outweighed by the benefits. So in the case of new software, I think you'd probably be, I'm sure this is part of the marketing and commercial rationale anyway. You're providing a product or a service that is filling a gap because it's going to improve healthcare. And the court would take that into account and say, well, look, the reason why the software is being used is because it is improving things. And we, the court, will take a view that a certain percentage of failure is acceptable. There is a lot of case law as well about products which failed, and the court has said you cannot expect a product to succeed in every case, and there will be a degree of failure which is acceptable. Exactly where that line is will be a matter for debate and for the court, but there is a line there. So some products are allowed to fail because the majority are successful.
So in relative to AI, because it's emerging with very little case law, there is an argument to say that the courts might be a bit more lenient if if the specific medical device fills a very important gap.
Yeah, absolutely. So this would be, and also you've got to bear in mind that this is stuff which is procured by hospitals, so they have identified a need for it.
Yeah.
And they've used it, and they've taken on your warnings about how it performs, and there's a clinical need for it because they've bought it and it's improving healthcare.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Should we just move on? How much time have we got, guys, for Q&A? When are we finishing?
Not much. I would say we are approaching the end of the sessions, but I think it's more important that you share your content, and then we can always channel the questions that might come later on.
Yeah, I will get through this. It's more some summary stuff to come. So that was a very useful look on history. And you can see from the questions we've received that there's lots to learn that will be helpful. You can take these slides away. This is sort of mitigation, really. So everything we've been talking about, steps you need to put in place. So in the event you may have litigation, you've taken good steps beforehand. For example, we were looking at the questions just now about if you're very clear with the IFU, the instructions you're giving to clinicians, you're warning about the risks, warning about the limitations, that'll stand you in good stead to prove that you did what you could to explain how the product works. Therefore, it's safe if used properly. I'll leave this with you as well. You may find you're involved in a complicated supply chain. So look at all these issues here. What are your agreements? If you're either supplying a component or you're taking on components or software from third parties, make sure you're allocating liability fairly so that in the event there's litigation, you know who's responsible for paying costs and damages. And finally, on the slide here, you may find all this useful for chats with insurers, and they will assess your products and services. And the more you've done to be litigation ready, and in many ways, war game this, be prepared for the worst case scenario, tighten up your procedures accordingly. Insurers will appreciate that because it shows your product is legally safer when it's put onto the market. And a few key things to take away. Yeah, plan ahead. Keep looking for the new law which is coming. I would do the war gaming, get ready for a potential crisis, and just keep on asking yourself, if we were sued, are we ready? Have we got documents ready for inspection? And you should probably be doing that anyway, whether it's a regulatory inspection or questions you may be getting from investors in the future. So I think that brings me to the end of the prepared bits.
Fantastic, Peter. Thank you very much. It's difficult to speak about, for those that are not in that profession, it's difficult to talk about liability risk, and prepare for the worst is always a bit of a tricky topic, but certainly planning ahead is one of the biggest advice that you certainly have provided today, as well as compliance is baseline only. I wrote that in capital letter in my notebook, so thank you very much for that. if we have any burning questions now, we might want to ask them now. Otherwise, if there is any questions later on, perhaps we are able to channel to you, Peter, later.
Yeah,
We will
sure.
do so. If there aren't any burning questions now, we'll oh yeah, there's Jada wants to ask a question.
Sorry, actually, I know we're nearly lunchtime. So I used to work for the Medical Defence Union, which is medical indemnity, and the line between responsibilities between AI and doctors' liability and responsibilities is kind of getting more blurred, especially when there's evidence that doctors or humans in general are over reliant on AI, and then at some point they'll just basically switch the brain off and then just do whatever the AI says. Is there any kind of indications out there about how the law is going to understand who's responsible? Because at the moment it's all doctors, but then there's going to be probably some strong evidence that there's probably algorithms are maybe too powerful in these certain circumstances.
Yeah, I would look at, for example, there's a good publication a while ago by Royal College of Surgeons that warns that clinicians have still got to exercise their human judgment. There's a fair amount from the MHRA on the same point as well. And general trend when people are talking about AI, whether it's medical devices or whether it's products more generally, is that this is a tool. We haven't yet got to the point of general artificial intelligence. We don't have yet systems which are accepted to be decision makers that are better than humans. So although you can, everyone's getting very excited about AI, I would just keep on emphasizing this is a tool put in the hands of a human decision maker. And you should find plenty of expert industry opinion to back up that as well.
But even in the context of doctors having to have, so many patients on their waiting list and under so much time pressure, and they're giving tools by their NHS, trusts to use. And it's still the responsibility of doctors to kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is it's a tool that will help them. It will speed things up, but it's their decision in the end. And I've done some litigation where there's a glitch in the software and a wrong recommendation was made by the software, but ultimately it was found in that case that there was a moment in the system where the doctor should have applied not just clinical judgment, but common sense. And that will always be the case. And I think as a manufacturer, you just got to keep on emphasizing that.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Extremely helpful, as I said, for me personally, and I guess for the audience as well. So thank you very much once again, and thank you for those attending.
No problem. Good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. See you soon.